Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from sunny West London. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today we are speaking to Fortean journalist and Twitterer extraordinaire, Cat Vincent. If this is your first encounter with Rune Soup, you can always find the show notes and a whole lot more at runesoup.com. But now, let's jump right on in. Mr. Vincent, ça va?
Hello there, Gordon. How are you, mate?
I'm doing good indeed. First things first, did you return home to snow this weekend?
No, I returned home to a flood.
That's not as good. That's not as good at all. I've been following a few people in your general area, as in at least from a latitudinal perspective, and some of them have got some quite good snow.
Yeah, they'd be a little bit higher up on the on the hillside. The specific bit of West Yorkshire that I'm in, which is a town called Hebden Bridge, was notoriously flooded about 3.5 years ago, to the point where it was on the international news. Like the whole lower half of the town was underwater. And that was the day before I moved there from Bristol.
That is kind of how these things go. Yeah. Now, fair enough. Anyway, for people who don't know, Hebden Bridge is kind of like the thinking weirdos Glastonbury. It's got a bunch of, crazy, weird denizens, like the person we're speaking to today. Very picturesque. I'm quite jealous from a location perspective of where Kat lives. All right, so seeing as, we actually technically did just speak on Friday in London, but seeing as we haven't really had a recording before, I figure we might start with your superhero origin story. So, Kat, when did you first know you were weird?
Oh, that's a vicious one. I guess when I was about 6 or 7 years old. My background was working poor. Grew up in a town, I was born in a town called Gravesend on the River Thames, which is pretty much noted only for the burial place of Pocahontas. It was a major port town way back in the days, not so much now. And so my parents moved around a lot from there, but my earliest memories are of a council house that literally backed onto the local municipal rubbish tip. So that was not an environment that was very conducive for a kid who was extremely bookish, very shy, read everything he could lay his hands on in the local library, and then started having precognitive dreams and weird synchronicities.
I see. And so these books, were you precocious in occult reading, or was it, were the vectors initially children's fiction? What's going on there if we sort of pull on that precognitive dream thread?
Well, the books that I ended up reading, I was blessed to have the most fantastic local library. By the time we lived in a town called Northfleet, again, right on the Thames, there was a librarian there who basically took pity on me. And once I'd read all the kids' books, and I was deep into mythology, I knew that there was something weird going on, and so myths and legends was where I went, allegedly and purportedly non-fiction. But so also, picking up a taste of science fiction and fantasy along the way. But the thing was that librarian then said, "Oh, well, here you go, have adult tickets." And then when I binged through the adult section, because it was really a very small library, they gave me closed shelf access. So I was literally reading Crowley and Tim Leary and Desard when I was about 10.
Nice. See, this interests me because when I was talking to Mog Morgan the other year, he had a similar story of a childhood library that had all these Victorian and Edwardian magic books, essentially on a locked shelf, and it's a government-funded library, obviously. And I find that quite interesting because I will tell you that there aren't too many libraries in Newcastle, Australia, that have that.
I imagine not. I'm not quite sure how the English library system managed to get so laissez-faire, but God love them for it. I think my introduction books, I'm just trying to remember, would have been Dorian Valiente's Natural Magic, and I quite strongly remember Francis Yates's Sexuality, Magic and Perversion making an impact on a prepubescent.
Yeah. Wow. So yeah, the librarian got the measure of you then.
Apparently so, and I wish I could remember who they were, and if they were still alive, I would send them a thank you card.
Yeah. Thank you. You did this.
It's all your fault.
Yeah. Nice one. Okay, so from a book perspective, when was it just a passing interest that sort of reactivated later in life, or was there a moment as a child you're like, I'm gonna have a play with this. The universe wants to play, and I choose to.
Okay, I'll tell you this one, and I think this is probably the first time I've actually told this story in a recorded venue. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I was convinced that I'd cursed one of my teachers to commit suicide.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I was bullied like fuck because small, shy, bookish, polysyllabic, but the teachers didn't like me either because I was too much of a smart ass and I finished the class early. And one teacher decided it would be a good idea to smack me around the head when I was helping another kid put their colouring pencils away.
I see.
And I came home and I was just fucking furious and with no real venting for it. And this internal scream came out of me. There's just this absolute kind of, it's like a key I blow. I mean, with my later martial art training, that was the closest parallel I could get. And next thing I know, the woman had lost her job, and a couple of months later, she hung herself. So that kind of made me think, oh shit, this stuff is real. And oh shit, I need to put a safety catch on that. So between those two, I was studying intently and very, very tentatively doing stuff and trying to make sure that I didn't, accidentally push anybody else. Now, of course, after 40 years plus, I look back on that and I think, almost certainly a coincidence, but possibly not just enough for me to kind of justify that early paranoia. But at the same time, I was like studying like fuck just to try and find out what the hell is this? How could that happen? And when I hit about 13, I mean, I've been doing Crowley, as I say, for quite some time. And fortunately, I managed to get a couple of other explainers. Kenneth Grant came across my transom pretty early. So it gave me some perspective. But then a copy of a little thing called Cosmic Trigger fell into my hands.
And this was around 13?
Yeah, it was probably about the year it came out in Britain in paperback. So I was just starting to hit puberty, and then the stuff I was reading in Crowley was getting kind of interesting in other ways than I had previously anticipated. Then along comes Bob, and it was very specifically reading Trigger and that idea he has of the multi-model approach, of being able to look at this stuff and put it down and re-distance yourself from it was an absolute eye-opener for me. It gave me a context for everything else that was going on without me having to deal with the religion side. And I'd gone through a short, very intense bit of very Christian, tying in with the fact I was raised wishy-washy Church of England.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And that hung around. So I had a couple of years or two as well. I was really intensely believing I was talking to God and Jesus on a personal level. And then the funny story on that one is I read Eric von Daniken.
Yeah.
And I went, oh my God, no, this whole Jesus thing is bullshit. And then a couple of weeks later I realised, yeah, but von Daniken's bollocks too. So I'd already gone through a period of belief and disbelief. And then Bob came along and says, oh, you can just, you can repeat that. Crowley did.
So where did you find this first copy of Cosmic Trigger? Was it a purchase in a bookstore? Can you remember? Was it in a library?
Very specifically, it was a second-hand copy in a little bookshop in the middle of a town called Dartford. I was going to Dartford Grammar School, which I got in on a 14 plus because, we were slightly more upwardly mobile at that point, but we still weren't exactly rolling in it. But I managed to get into this, blag my way in basically on my smarts. Probably the best known kid who went to that school is one Mick Jagger.
Oh, cool.
So that was kind of like an interesting antecedent. But yeah, I was just like wandering in there, and I saw Crowley mentioned on the back cover, and I went, "All right, I'm up for this." And there was also volumes 2 and 3 of Illuminatus, but not volume 1. So for years, I only had the end of the story without actually knowing how it began.
That almost exactly parallels right down to the age my discovery of both of them as well. A secondhand bookstore in Newcastle, Australia, Cosmic Trigger 1 and an incomplete Illuminatus, which meant I just left them on the shelves. I didn't buy them. But and my purchase decision was actually quite similar as well. You turned over and I mean, mine wasn't a first edition because it would have been late 80s. Yeah, mine wasn't a first edition, but it had quotes from people I recognize. I think it might even be the New Falcon one that said this book should be sold by prescription, and I'm like, I'll be having you.
Yeah.
Very interesting indeed. So from finding Cosmic Trigger, I mean, how did that define the rest of your adolescence? Because he has some, it certainly, well, let me back it up with a personal anecdote. He was the permission I needed to maybe experiment entheogenically in ways that I potentially wouldn't have as an adolescent. And I'm just wondering if you had a sort of similar mildly druggy school experience. I mean, he was quite the enabler for people just coming into adolescence.
No, I didn't actually get anywhere near to drugs until I was about 19 or 20, just because I didn't have any mates who were holding.
Nice.
So yeah, but there was a certain degree of, shall we say, strongly visualized masturbatory-based sex magic workings.
Well, so it's the only kind you can get when you're 13.
Exactly. I got my neurological kicks that way.
Nice.
But the fun thing then was I got connected to science fiction fandom. I went to my first convention. It was a Star Trek convention in 1980. An absolutely lovely time. Went with a friend. Thought, oh my God, these are my people. I found my tribe. And a couple of years later, I became very involved in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fandom. It just started up on the radio, and the books had come out. And I was like, oh my God, this is hilarious. And started up with the very nascent fan club ZZ9 Claw Z Alpha. And it was meeting those guys at little like fan meets and pub meets in my early 20s. Well, I actually first met other magicians. And of course, that was a breakthrough moment. And of course, the fun thing is that almost all of them were inveterate tabletop roleplay gamers.
Yes, they do seem to align.
Yeah, this is great. But one of them, if he's out there, hello, Wag, a man called John Waggart, who was probably my first magic buddy. He was quite notorious. There's a tale he told of him running Call of Cthulhu to players who were on LSD.
Nice.
And he built a slow, really just... I wasn't a player, I just heard this anecdotally. But he built this really slow, creepy 3 or 4 hours as it was coming up. And then in the middle of it, he pulled a rubber octopus out from under the table and threw it at them.
Oh, very cool. So, I mean, jumping through to that early, or actually, early 20s, late teens, when you encountered other magicians, were you a joiner?
I never really joined any of the clubs. We did some sort of loose workings. One of the more interesting groups I got connected with around then was, they didn't even have the term in those days, but basically it was a group of otherkin. Identifying as Tolkien elves, and genuinely believe that that their spirits were that. So I went through a short period of feeling like there was some reincarnation shit going on with there, and that was kind of mixed in with the Wilson. For a few years, I was semi-convinced I was some kind of tentacled creature from Sirius reborn on Earth, but I grew out of that, thankfully. I find the other kin people fascinating, and I love them to bits because having the courage to actually just go out there and say, no, I'm just not going to conform to that huge a degree of saying my soul isn't even human is great. But I do see it as a developmental stage of like you try one of those and then you go to try some more fiction suits. It's the repeating and the trying something. I don't grasp the idea of getting stuck in one system very well. Possibly because I'm not just very good at it, but possibly because Bob's ideas hit me just at the right point for me to just be suspicious of all systems, especially including my own.
So, I guess to elaborate on that otherkin idea, do you think it's, when you say developmental stage, is the sort of net benefit to run through a whole bunch of those worldviews where you think you're kind of one of James Cameron's Smurfs and then an elf, and then you kind of look back and go, well, I'm probably not them, but I also am probably not me, or that is just as flimsy?
Yeah, exactly that. That at the end of all this immense long fucking process that I've been through all my life, I'm kind of Taoist in the sense that I think there's unquestionably something out there, but any attempt to describe it in human language falls down very rapidly. And that all of these little techniques, all of these little attempts to experiment with the interface between oneself and Tao, they can triangulate fairly well. So you're pointing from a whole bunch of different directions. And that way, to fuck with the old metaphor, you're pointing at the moon, but you're pointing at it from several different trajectories. So you might get a little bit closer in actually narrowing down to something useful.
Well, you're in good company if you sort of ended up a rogue Taoist, because that's more or less where Crowley ended up.
Indeed.
You know, just using the I Ching to decide whether to go to the dentist, and it's kind of a nice resting belief system for him to retire on is how I think about it, because he'd done it all by then, and it all works. But it's also kind of not necessarily pointless, but it's also completely pointless and completely essential. And then once you've done interfacing, to use your term, then it's sort of still out there. You're sort of still here. The universe is going to carry on.
Yeah, it's definitely going to carry on without you. So it's that fun thing of when you've done enough magic, there's a particular kind of, I don't know, situational arrogance that you need to do, is because, once you accept that you're trying to fuck with the universe by the power of your own will, then you're going to get to be a bit of an egomaniac. Which, we've seen the results of that. And the problem, which I always used to call magitis, of someone who is convinced that they're the god emperor of the universe, but still living in their mum's basement.
Yeah, and just to turn back to phases, I think that is a phase. It's quite intoxicating when you realize that creation is malleable in that way, but you do end up growing out of it, and you also end up, and I found this interesting with my first kind of clairaudient spirit experiences, that the beings I would speak to were surprisingly laissez-faire about my situation, more so than I was. It was sort of like, oh, everything will be all right. And you go, oh, but I'm poor and lonely. What are you doing? And they kind of have a longer view of it. Like, it'll be all right. You'll be dead soon from our perspective. And I'm like, oh, when is that? What's happening?
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. And I think that's where you end up in it's almost like a misunderstood shamanic Taoism, because it's just the spirit world's there. You can talk to it. It can talk to you. Things just carry on.
Yeah. I should mention parenthetically, the other big influence coming up was the other Wilson, Colin.
Oh, of course. Well, let's talk about that.
I found The Occult and Mysteries in the big fat paperback editions round about the same time, and it was just so attractive to read someone who was that smart. Another working class lad who just pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and then just went and got really fucking weird and didn't care who knew it. And funny that the book of his, which other than the supernatural ones, the one that really impressed me is A Criminal History of Mankind. You know that one?
I know it. I have not read it.
It was a very important text for me. Basically, what happened was Wilson started corresponding with the science fiction author A. Van Vogt, who was working on a book about concentration camp guards. And what he was doing research for this, he was trying to understand this concept of how you could do that as your day job and then go home to the wife and kids. The more he examined it, the more examples he found of what he eventually called the right man or the violent male. His idea was that this is a kind of high-functioning sociopath alpha male who is so convinced of their own righteousness that they can just batter their way through life, and anything that disagrees with them either bounces off or drives them into screaming rage. And Wilson looked at this and went, oh, hang on. That describes pretty much every important figure in human history, doesn't it? And he described them as basically it's the heart of being a true criminal, is you don't care about anything at all except for your own gratification and your own power. So he rewrote the history of human history, you know what I mean, rewrote the entire development of Western history from the point of view of it was fuckers like that who did all the damage, but at the same time were also the great generals, the great leaders, the great politicians and economic drivers. That's become kind of topical again when you look at that film that examines corporations as as entities having the same basic tenets of sociopathy.
It's also, it slightly reminds me of Frankie Boyle in his second most recent book, saying the 5,000-year experiment of letting the cunts run the world isn't going very well.
Exactly that. I mean, when you have a world run by cunts, everything just, becomes a problem. Did you see Frankie's talk at, see or read, recently he did a lecture at the South Bank a couple of days ago.
No, I haven't. I saw him mention it on Twitter, but I'm sure I'll hunt it up.
Oh, it's bloody good. And I'm sure you'll be deeply amused by the fact he then went on to recommend Wilson's 8 brain model.
Oh, very cool. Okay. Which we were going to get to in a sec. Interesting. I don't know if you've seen him in conversation with Grant Morrison.
I'm not sure I've seen that one. I love what as a comedian, he kind of makes me laugh in spite of myself. But as a writer, as an intellect, I find him fascinating and really very sharp. And I know that it's mates with Grant, so interesting.
Yeah, it's readily available on YouTube. Where he suddenly grew in my esteem, as you say, he's a very good comedian. But I read his, I think it must have been about 2009 or 10 when. Comedian autobiographies were the kind of Christmas book you got, and I got his My Shit Life So Far. And you go about 2/3 of the way into it, and then he's like, by the way, I've seen aliens. When I lived in London, I would, mess about with chaos magic, and I hallucinated Morpheus from The Matrix while on the tube, and here's a screenplay I wrote about aliens. And you're like, hang on. You haven't mentioned this before, and I particularly like that. You can sort of, in that find the other's way, you can almost tuning fork resonate with the kind of people even that are a little bit weird, even if it's not immediately obvious in their output. So I'm definitely a Frankie fan in that respect. But yeah, so moving on, or sort of pulling back to. The autobiographical story. We're in early 20s. So I guess tell the story of what we might call your mid-career magical journey from the 20s on.
Most of that was in science fiction fandom, hanging out with this crowd of people I'd found there. With the elves and Wag and the other role-playing, somewhat chaosy. Several of them ended up joining OTO. Basically was, the continuation, if you go all the way back, but the start of a higher order of a continuing flow of synchronicities. We used to do things like when we had the monthly pub meets. This was way back when it was still at the One Ton in Hatton Garden. Every month on the first Thursday, the science fiction fans would meet up and have a natter.
So when you talk about the synchronicities, what are we talking about? Can you think of any examples?
We would just go for a wander. I mean, I didn't know the termination then, but basically, it's your actual situation is to derive. We'd just follow the synchronicities on street signs, graffiti. We'd just wander around, look for the next sign that the universe gave us. So we'll end up walking that way. And we ended up exploring a lot of back alleys, dodgy parts of town that had this tremendous liminal energy to them of places that are kind of within the cracks, behind the scenes. There was this intense energy to them. We used to do explorations, street rituals, occasional summonings, occasionally finding things that we actually had to go and have a smack at. You can find some quite unpleasant things down those dark alleys.
Yes, even now with the gentrification. I mean, the One Ton's still quite a little bit of a ropey pub, but the area has the area is now filled with sort of design media companies and so on. But I used to work in the area. When the sun goes down, it's still filled with weird.
Yeah, I've not been back there for years. I moved around quite a lot after that. I ended up moving to Edinburgh when I was 28, which is interesting because around about that time, first of all, I'd started reading Hellblazer,
mm-hmm.
which, as somebody whose magic is very distinctly urban, it was kind of like, oh, fuck me, they wrote someone for me. And that really strong identification with John Constantine as like a lower for the kind of magical interactions I was having. The same kind of improvised, I'll just, do something with a bit of spit and a fag end. That was so far away from what I was reading in grimoires and from the other fantasy stories of the time. I mean, round about then, the big thing was the Mists of Avalon as a contemporary.
Yeah.
So along comes Conjob, and I thought, oh my God, this is my geezer. And down the One Ton, I got chatting to a young up and coming comics guy who'd just written an issue for Hellblazer. It was kind of interesting. A chap called Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, nice.
So, and one drunken night, he quietly told me, yeah, Kat, that story's kind of autobiographical. If you know the issue, its story's called Hold Me. And it's about an encounter Constantine has with the ghost of a homeless man. Neil wasn't terribly specific, but I rather suspect that he had a similar encounter from the context of what he was saying. And that's the reason that while he's fascinated by magic, he doesn't actually dabble. That was enough to put the shits up him.
Interesting, because he of this sort of British invasion. If you sort of plot them on a spectrum, Alan Moore came to it late, but he's the closest to full-blown magician, and then you sort of have Grant somewhere in the middle, and then Neil, who stands at the back. But I actually think if he'd followed it, he would have ended up somewhere near Alan Moore when you think about Sandman and how he conceptualizes Lucifer and basically the Eternals, and I think that, as you say, it's someone who realized it exists and decided, I'm probably not going to play with it.
Yeah, and the nice thing is about Neil is that he never read an idea he didn't like. It always goes into the notes. So I ended up moving up to Edinburgh, and the girl I was living with, who's a lovely lady called Lucy, is one of the three women that Delirium in Sandman is directly based on.
They're cool.
She's absolutely tiny, little redhead, very hippie, witchy young woman at the time from Alderley Edge, Alan Garner's stomping ground.
Oh, cool.
So it kind of comes by that energy, honestly. The story goes that Delirium is basically made of three people. Lucy, a woman who Lucy and I were in an orgy once while we were members of the Edinburgh bisexual group, and Tori Amos, who we have not slept with.
Yes. Yeah, of course. So, I mean, that kind of That's another Neil Gaiman connection there with Tori
Indeed.
Amos. Yeah.
To the point where when we were up in Edinburgh and hanging out in just the worst part of town, literally we were in the part of Edinburgh that Trainspotting was set in when Trainspotting the novel came out.
And what was the reason for the move? Just for the hell of it?
Well, London wasn't working for me. I'd had a really messy breakup with my girlfriend, and fandom had taken her side in the conversation. So I thought, no, I had a friend in Edinburgh offered me crash space.
Well, that'll do it.
Yeah, so went up there for a while. But stayed in touch with Neil off and on. He would occasionally phone up and we'd natter about theory of magic till the wee small hours, because he knew we did late nights. Because then I was in my druggy phase.
Yeah.
I was pretty much, I was stoned and doing acid and mushrooms most of the time. So I ended up quoted in Sandman. There's a bit towards the end of the Kindly Ones that Neil took straight out of a phone conversation we had. And it's the bit where somebody says, at the end of the day, it's all just weird shit.
Well, claim to fame.
Indeed.
Nice one.
That's always a nice one to drop at parties, especially with goths. But the other thing around that time is that I'd started to kind of specialise in, and I use the term quite freely, combat magic. Because people knew I was weird, they would come to me with their little problems of I'm feeling like I'm haunted, I think I've got bad luck. And then I found that delightful little thing of bitchcraft, of you get these little coven wars, and if some poor bugger got caught in the middle, then they'd be throwing curses around. And obviously most of those curses don't work, because, frankly, their tradecraft's not very good. But every now and then you get one that did. And after my school experience, I really, really don't like bullies, particularly ones that use the occult to bully other people, and especially when they're civilians. So I ended up getting this kind of ad hoc training in battle magics, strong shielding, counter spells, some really nice tricks to kind of hack other people's practice of magic. I think there was a level where I was trying to work on the kind of machine code level rather than the desktop interface that most people use in their occultism. They don't go really deep into what's behind their spells, what the background mythoses are. And once you find certain commonalities, you can find the weak points in the system.
Yeah.
And then you can either hack through the system they're using, which is easy enough once you've gone through 7 or 8 systems, or you can find the system which is sufficiently orthogonal to them that it'll come in at their absolute weakest point. So I ended up doing that for about 10 years or so. And then, okay, this is the part where the story gets even more fun. While I was living in Edinburgh, I was openly polyamorous and experimenting a bit with bisexuality with Darling Lucy. And we went to a conference. Britain actually has a BICON, a bisexuality conference, annually, and has done for about 20 years, which is kind of fab. So I went to one on the bill with some interesting people. They also talk about spirituality and being queer. And I was on the panel with a rather interesting Scottish lady called Kirsty.
Uh-huh.
And we hit it off within about 2 days after that. We were lovers. And it just became just really the most intense and, point-turning relationship in my life. It was threesome with Lucy for a while. Then Lucy went off with her true love, who she'd been kind of waiting for years, who was married to someone else. And I went down to Leeds with Kirsty. And a year after that, I met this American woman at WorldCon who also fell for, and went out to the States with her, and then she fell for Kirsty as well. And we ended up moving to Bristol together as a triad.
So how long were you in Leeds?
I was in Leeds for about a year and a half.
Gotcha.
Then Bristol for 15 years.
Right. And why Bristol? Was that just seemed to be the place to be?
I had friends there, very good friends, including Dinah Wynne-Jones.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very dear friend who I miss terribly, obviously.
Mm.
Who was quite witchy in her own quiet way as well. So yeah, we ended up in Bristol, and the American ex, kind of wealthy. Kirsty and I are both on the dole, so we ended up as kind of a kept couple for a while, which is very nice.
Yeah, it's the way to do it.
Because Kirsty's an artist, and it gave her the freedom to do that. And she also had a 2-year-old son, who I kind of adopted. And so we were all in this shared house situation in a somewhat battered but still very, very splendid Georgian townhouse in Clifton, the poshest part of Bristol. And during that time, I was able to, because the ex was funding us, I thought, what do I want to do when I grow up, since I don't have to worry about keeping a roof over my head? So I went pro. I launched a paranormal security protection company.
Right.
Nice long pause there. And yeah, in 2001, I founded this group called Athanor Consulting. And basically, combat mage for hire. We come in, we break your curse, we'd protect your house, we'd cleanse it. Because I could afford to, I didn't charge too much for the service, probably far less than I could have got away with. I don't know if you remember, but this is around about the time of the big feng shui boom of the early 2Ks.
No, I do remember.
It was at the point where there were literally 3 monthly feng shui magazines in W.H. Smith's.
Wow.
And I was looking through this and I was thinking, these cunts are charging 250 quid an hour to rearrange your furniture. I could actually do something for people. So I charged 60 quid an hour, literally £1 a minute, to go in and genuinely tackle bad, weird shit on behalf of other people. Did this for about 6 or 7 years, had some interesting stories, obviously, off the back of that one, most of which I really can't tell because of client privilege.
Well, pick a couple of them that you can.
Oh, there was one of the weirdest ones was out in the sticks where somebody was having problems with what, for want of a better term, we'll call pixies.
Mm-hmm.
Small, mischievous, sprite-like things. We came in, we did a clean-up. We had to do a second remote zap on the place afterwards. But there was a point where my team and I were wandering around in the woods, not far from this thing. This was very strange. We could all see very clearly, about 400 yards away in the middle of this woods, a burnt-out car. Absolutely clear as day. It was. This was not kind of that sort of head-up display kind of thing that you get with a lot of magic and spirit connections. This was a physical object within our visual field.
Yeah.
Except that as soon as we approached it, it vanished. It just became like a trompe d'oeil. But you step back again, and it was there again. And we kind of circled around it, and for about 70 degrees of arc, this thing was clearly visible until you tried to approach it. And the actual area where it was kind of like this weird little dead zone of like just spiritually nothing, no birds, no. There was plant life, but that weird silence you get.
Yeah.
We didn't even fucking try and do that. We just kind of noted it, tagged it, and stuck a bloody great shield around it as best as we could. But I think that was probably the most proper weird thing I encountered on the job. So yeah, as I said, I did this mostly for kicks, but for occasional pay for a few years. And then the EU's fraud regulations changed to not going with innocent until proven guilty, but vice versa. They went for the kind of Napoleonic version. So all it would need was for some disgruntled customer to say, oh, his spell didn't work, I'm going to sue his ass, and I'd have been ruined.
Yeah.
So I politely backed out at that point. And then, yes, continuing the kind of biographical frame, it was around about then I was starting to do some writing, online stuff, just blogging, a lot of stuff at Live Journal, and ended up joining the very start of the Warren Ellis founded online forum Whitechapel, which was around a webcomic he was doing at the time called Freak Angels, which is set in a post-apocalyptic Whitechapel, where basically the Midwich cuckoos had ended the world and we're all living in the flooded remains trying to sort out what to do next. Good book. But it pulled in this amazing range of different talents, different individuals. It was the place where Kelly Sue McGonick and Matt Fraction started dating, for example. It was the place where Kieran Gillen and Jamie McKelvey first met and started plotting Phonogram. It was a place where Les Cott came up. So there's this incredible nexus, and not just of comic writers and artists, but of artists generally. It was a really supportive place. Now, it's kind of faded away to shit rags and spam at this point, but there was a small period there when I was just starting to develop and think that I could be a writer. It was incredibly supportive, and a couple of places gave me the first times I could write online for someone else rather than just sticking stuff up on my own blog. So I was starting to appear in other places and then started to be published. James Curcio's Modern Mythology site ran a couple of my things. And then there was an anthology version of that called The Apocalyptic Imaginary that reprinted some of my stuff, some of my early thoughts on Hyperreal Religion, which I'm sure we'll get to later on.
Yeah.
But around about this time is when the ex-wife started to get into ayahuasca. And she went off and studied as a curandera in Peru in like 6-month intervals, leaving us to like run the house. And then after a couple of years of this, we had a falling out, and she decided after the ayahuasca gods had told her that she was going to divorce us.
I see.
But she was fine. Yeah, she's still doing her thing. She's quite well known on that scene. But I did okay in the divorce. Okay enough for me and Kirsty to move to Hampton Bridge and have a reasonable income. So as long as I'm still selling the occasional story now and then, I do a bit of online copy just to make a bit of money on the side. But that's enough to keep us so that Kirsty can work as an artist and I can work as a writer without that horrible fear of poverty, bio-survival anxiety, as Bob will call it. So that's the part of the tale which most people find hardest to believe, and that includes me. To be honest, I still pinch myself every now and then going, I have an investment broker.
Yeah, that was never something you were looking at when you were 13, I suppose.
No, and it's that weird shock of having gone literally from working poor to bourgeoisie rentier in the space of half a century. Pretty much every stage in between gives you an odd perspective. But the end result of that was that I started actually writing. The first people to start paying me was my man Greg Taylor at Daily Grail.
Of course, he was there.
Just came up, yeah. So for the context of the listeners, Friday night, Greg came over from Australia with his family. So it was the first time I had a chance to actually meet my editor and publisher I've been working for about 4 years at this point. And we managed to drag some of the most interesting of British Forteans along to the pub meet to go with it, as well as people who was publishing. I remember we had Mark Pilkington there. He had Scott from London Fortean Society, John Higgs, the marvellous John Higgs, David Southwell, who's an absolute star.
Yeah.
So it's a shame you had to leave before the evening.
To be honest, I'm still unwell, so I'm starting to sort of get double vision, and I'm like, no, this man flu is kicking my ass, so I had to go home.
No, understandable.
But next time, Gadget.
Yeah, it will happen again. So so at that point, with this weird career of occult dabbling and stuff behind me, I was starting to get interested in the idea. I'll use the technical term which I came across: hyperreal religion, which is belief systems based entirely on known fiction. The term's coined by an Australian sociologist called Adam Possamai. I read it in just a short interview with him on a very interesting blog called Theophantastique, which is about the crossover between religion and popular culture. And he was a sociologist of religion who was taking this stuff very seriously, contextualizing it in terms of, what do you do in a postmodern late capitalist society when all the grand narratives have been undermined? You've got to find your myths somewhere. And to use Chris Knowles' lovely phrase in his book, our gods wear spandex.
They do. I'm not convinced we're making too many good ones in the last 10 or so years. It's interesting to me that this kind of, hyperreality or even second wave chaos magic in the 90s had some very good material to work with, which we just don't do anymore. If you look across pop culture now, you think, what are you going to draw on for pop culture magic now? Like your gods are 20 years old now, and I find that interesting and dismaying.
Yeah, it's fascinating to look at the kind of young generation. The Tumblr Magicians, God love them, starting from absolute scratch and then drawing on supernatural as their mythos. Or grim, and it's like, that's really interesting, and it's very, very funny when those guys encounter John Constantine. The amount of people that I've seen go, "Oh look, some bastard's ripping off Castiel."
Yeah,
guys.
Yeah.
It's that interesting thing of that a lot of the material that they're working with now is. Perhaps suspect, but the fact that they're working with those materials at all and just saying, well, fuck it, we can absolutely pick our own gods here. Obviously, you have to go back to what's his name? I really should remember that. It's Talk Among Yourselves while I look at my bookshelf to remind myself of the name.
It's all good.
But Joanne, who did the first books on pop culture magic?
Taylor
Elwood.
Sorry. Okay, fair enough.
Sorry, Taylor. I really shouldn't have learned your name, mate. But he was actually setting out the store. So 8 years ago, first version of that came out. He's writing the second version, the second edition of Pop Culture Magic now, I think. Well, I know he is. I've seen the draft. But at least there was, a body of work out there. There's a set of tools that people can use. But it wasn't so much the magicians that interested me. It was the ones who were doing it spontaneously. The Order of the Jedi, and how these pop culture myths could blossom out. And then I encountered a chap called Slenderman.
Yes.
When Slendy first appeared, I think I got into him during the first year, through the video series Marble Hornets, which, as someone who's done field parapsychology and street combat magic, is genuinely some of the scariest shit I've ever seen. As a piece of horror fiction, Marble Hornets absolutely stands up. It's a bit long, but there's sequences in that which I would put with amongst the greats of any horror movie. And it fascinated me to go back and research this and see how quickly that mythology built itself off of the back of a Photoshop competition and something awful. Within the space of 10 days, they had defined the background mythos just in the comments about this. They'd established it couldn't be killed, it had a liking for trees, it preyed mostly on children, sometimes make them vanish, and that it was probably a tulpa, which of course becomes tremendously self-referential when all these people are saying, well, maybe we're creating the tulpa. Maybe by the sheer act of writing about this, we're making him real. Which led to a flurry of blogs doing this a kind of alternate reality game, blogging as though Slenderman was real and as though he was becoming an influence on their lives. This went on for several years as a very busy scene in the background. And then just about a year and a half ago, there was that awful incident in Waukesha, Wisconsin, where a 12-year-old girl was knifed up by two of her classmates for them to try and summon Slenderman with a human sacrifice. It was a terrible thing, and it pretty much leveled me up as a journalist, because I'd already written about this stuff for Daily Grail. I'd done 2 articles on it. I'd done some lectures. So when the story hit, all of a sudden I started getting phone calls from The Guardian and from international press, because I was a noted name who'd been studying it for some years. So The Guardian ran a piece on Slendy and they quoted me. And when in the quote, I described myself as a Fortean journalist, which I thought was, it's reasonable, it's what I do. And they put me down as journalist for Fortean Times.
Yeah.
I went, oh shit. So I put out a tweet to Fortean Times and I said, look, I'm really sorry, I did not say that. I did not claim to be one of your journos. And I got a tweet back from David Sutton and he said, well, you say that, we're commissioning a piece on Slenderman from you.
There you go.
So last August, cover of Fortean Times, and it was kind of like one of the great moments of my life. got it framed on the wall and everything.
Oh, very nice.
So yeah, so at that point, I pretty much considered I turned pro. So I pitched a book to Greg, which should, in theory, be coming out next year once I finish the fucker. That's going to be all about the Hyperreal Religion thing. It'll be called New Gods and Monsters. And yeah, it's going to be going back, probably starting with Alan Moore and Glycon, and then coming up to the modern day of just what people do with drawing their spiritual sustenance from fiction. One of the key ones I'm going to be talking about there is the Church of All Worlds. Mm-hmm. Huge influence on American paganism and thus Wicca ever since. Entirely based on Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, with bits of Star Trek's Iddick thrown in.
Yep.
Their influence is huge. Green Egg, the fanzine, was absolutely integral to the shape of modern paganism. Totally based on fiction. Which is why I get really funny when Wiccans get all hot under the collar about pop culture magic.
Well, they get hot under the collar about a lot of things.
This is true.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the potted biography, mate. What else do you want to know?
That's not bad. No, that's good. That's very neatly up to date and gives us, what am I looking at time-wise here? Gives us another good half an hour to have a chat about some of the things we briefly discussed on Friday and also things that we've kind of mentioned on Twitter beforehand, which is, I guess, the change or ongoing prominence of Robert Anton Wilson, both in your life and in culture generally, especially as you mentioned Tumblr, in a world that I think needs to look a little bit closer at the original material rather than retumbling out of context quotes.
Yes, we've knocked that one a few times, but it's definitely one that needs talking about because, as you say, there is a tendency on social media to go for the soundbite.
Yeah,
and this kind of chop and changing, and you can sling around all those little things as you like, and some people, yeah, as you say, do get just the wrong impression. But at the same time, you've got. Specifically with Wilson, we have a major upswing on that as a result of Daisy Campbell.
Yep.
So the backstory on that one. Daisy is the daughter of Ken Campbell, who mounted the stage version of Illuminatus. She was conceived backstage during the stage version of Illuminatus.
I did not know that.
And her middle name is Eris.
Yeah.
So obviously her life's been a bit odd. She'll happily talk about the fact that working with Ken on the warp and various other things, it got to the point that she was basically drowning in synchronicity. And literally, she was quietly sectioned in a friendly little place in Kent. And she turned up on arrival wearing a pair of rainbow-coloured knickers on her head because that was important.
Gotcha.
But stabilised herself after that and was able to withdraw from it somewhat. But she was constantly getting these people saying, you really should restage Illuminatus. And she goes, I've no interest in doing that. And then it struck her, but I could stage Cosmic Trigger, because there's a bit in that talks about Ken staging Illuminatus. So there could be a section of the play which she reconstructs her dad staging Illuminatus. And so she went to crowdfund this thing. It worked pretty well. Because I'd been in a volume of Dark Law with John Higgs, an extract from his KLF book, and I'd heard he was involved in it. So I went to one of the early fundraisers for this in the Horse Hospital, which is a great night, some fascinating stuff. And then they let drop that, oh yeah, we've got Alan Moore to come and play the computer fuck up.
Cool.
Yeah, to video recordings for that. So I had a whole chunk of stuff with Alan being very, very helpful, and John got to know Alan through writing the KLF book and other stuff. So I got chatting to Daisy, and it was nice to actually talk to John. And Daisy said, yeah, we're going to do another fundraiser in Liverpool. And I thought I'd do a street ritual because there's the bust of C.G. Jung in Matthew Street, just down from where the Cavern Club was, which had been commissioned by the great Liverpool counterculture leaders, Peter Harrigan, who was also the guy who helped Ken found the Science Fiction Theatre of Liverpool.
Okay, didn't know that.
Which is just down the road from there.
Yeah.
And there's a whole thing about that point in Matthew Street being a place where Carl Jung's dream of Liverpool took place, in which a town he'd never been to, but he saw it as being literally the pool of life, as kind of like the centre of cosmic power, which also affected Bill Drummond to the point where he once did a 24-hour meditation standing on the manhole cover just across from there. Literally, he stood there for a whole day meditating on Jung's pool of life. So, yeah, Peter Harrigan had a statue, a bust of Jung commissioned and put up on the wall there. So right in the middle of Matthew Street, which is obviously a really noisy main drag with all, Beatles impersonators thronging up and down it, there's this little shrine to synchronicity. So I said, right, I'll come up to that. That was February the 23rd, obviously. 2013, 14. Time gets blurry. So I was going up on the train, and I'd already sort of suggested this to Daisy, and I said, okay, well, if you're going to be doing a thing in Liverpool about synchronicity, maybe invoking John Constantine would be useful. So we did. It's about 50 of us after the fundraiser went out to the bust of Jung, and I did a small working for con job, lobbed a packet of 26 cut up behind the bust, probably still there, and we made a little human pyramid and put Daisy's rainbow knickers on Carl's head.
Oh, cool.
You can find a YouTube video.
I'm sure I will. Yeah. Put that one in the show notes.
Oh, yeah. And it seemed to go well because Daisy was able to both raise the money and actually get the clearance from Wilson's oldest daughter to stage the thing in the first place. And it was an amazing thing. They did a 2-day festival to mount it, and then with all sorts of other stuff coming around it. They had Adam Go-Rightly, who's the kind of Discordian archivist, come over from the States. They had Robert K.G. Temple come over, whose Serious Mystery, of course, was a huge influence on Wilson. He's pretty much the last man standing from that group. He was very interesting. And just some lovely, lovely people from Britain and all over. And it was called the Find the Others Festival. And by fuck did we. Robin Ince came up, did a stand-up for us. And the day after, we actually put the play on, which was fucking amazing. It is genuinely a very powerful, very moving, very funny production. The key thing is it shows Wilson as just a flawed, fallible, kind of a fuck-up of a human being, but who was just off on one in such a significant way that he changed culture after him. Well played, well cast, and there's a scene in it in which Daisy, playing her own mother, Prunella G, reenacts her own conception. Yeah. We're going to see about long-term effects on that one. But yeah, the Sunday after that, Daisy popped up to me and said, "Okay, are you ordained?" Yeah, technically, Universal Life Church. Yeah, well, since all my friends are here and my boyfriend's here, I thought we'd get married. Could you just, do that for me? So I ended up improvising a wedding ceremony on 4 hours' notice.
Nice.
Just calling a wedding ceremony. It seemed to work very well. They're still together after the first anniversary. And the plan is to restage it in the States on the 10th anniversary of Bob's death in Santa Cruz. There'll be another British run. They did 2 days in Liverpool and 5 days in London. It was sold out. But they're going to bring the play back. And I think that current, the people who are doing stuff off of the back of that, most of them, I think, get the point of Wilson better than the Tumblr meme posters.
Yeah, no, I completely agree there. It's not that the... what Wilson hasn't had, and I think he deserves, is the Crowley treatment, which is turning him back into a human.
Yes.
And that was when I sort of mentioned this, because it was a couple of years ago in a blog post now, and I ended up talking to Nick Majerison and whatever about it. That hasn't happened, and he was flawed and a product of his time. And I think he deserves us being able to say that. One, because he would agree. And two, it allows you to... if you don't do that, you get trapped in the shallow end of the pool, which was his. A lot of his consciousness stuff, I mean, we spoke about the 8-circuit model on Friday. It's a piece of shit. And he lifted it from Leary anyway, but like we're dealing with sort of guesses about how the mind works that are now 40 years old. That's not where the value of Wilson is, and I find the same thing when it comes to his geopolitics and even his understanding of culture. It is very much a product of its time, and the thing that I feel like people focus on the wrong piece, which is his conclusions rather than his method. And it's not to say that he doesn't have relevance. I mean, you just went on this whole long story about how he very much does, and does still have the capacity, when approached correctly, to change culture. My concern is the people who are using that correctly are in a minority, and we run off in this sort of hagiographic world where he's just quotes about how you can't ever really know anything about conspiracy being retumbled across the internet. And I'm like, I'm sorry, not in a post-Snowden world. I kind of feel like we can. And if he were around, I kind of feel like he would agree.
Yes, it's that interesting thing of, what would Bob make of our modern world? And yes, the problem with hagiographing him, of raising it, of putting him on a pedestal, it's a problem with anyone. The thing about 8 circuits, though, and I will kind of like chuck this in there, is one of the core things, of course, with chaos or any other magic, is the idea that any system can be used to produce magic, even if it's complete bollocks.
Yeah, absolutely. But by the same token, if you're after optimization, you use another one, see if another one that actually more accurately appears to map how the brain works, does that provide better results? And that's the piece that is missing. People get stuck in the shallow end of kind of picking up his secondhand ideas from his MK Ultra friend Tim Leary and stop there. And that's not, you're welcome to go through it. We all did. That's what it's there for.
Yeah.
And it's the persistence of the those pieces that I think trap people in a sort of semantic shallow end, which I don't think he would have liked.
No, nor me. When I did my talk on Bob at Treadwell's, I did make a point of saying I don't use the 8 circuits. And I know there were people in the audience who had recently gone through the Anterior Alley course on 8 circuits, and they've got a lot of benefit from that. But the things that I always emphasize, the things I learned best from Bob was that key thing of the model agnosticism. Of, look, you've just got to accept the fact that any structure we use to describe reality is going to be shit in some way and will need to be constantly revised. You need to keep going back, checking the details, chucking out what doesn't work. It has to be an ongoing process. And I think it's sad that we never got to see Bob's ongoing process continue a bit longer. This, funny enough, came up a couple of weeks ago for part of the ongoing thing for a thing called Festival 23, which is going to launch next summer. which is a kind of little improvised, let's do the show right here weekend festival for some of the people who turned up at Find the Others. And we had an inaugural chaos ritual, which Dave Lee did for us. And I hadn't seen Dave in the thick end of 20 years, but we'd still been mates online. I knew him somewhat back in Leeds. But I got the chance to actually talk to Dave and ask about how much influence Wilson had on the IoT at its foundation. Because, I mean, to me, it's really obvious that they must have read him. I mean, not just from the name, but the fact that the multi-model approach is such an integral part of chaos magic. And what Dave actually said was, we took almost nothing from Wilson. He had no technology there for us to steal. Because essentially the only tech you get from reading Wilson is, other than that idea of being, model agnostic, is it's interesting to do LSD combined with a Crowley ritual.
Yeah, or LSD combined with yoga or whatever. There's not, from a tech perspective, it's not really there. So that doesn't surprise me. I mean, Pete Carroll actually wrote a blog post about it last month, I think, saying he was a bit, not alarmed, bemused, I guess, angrily bemused in a very Pete way, at the persistence and prominence of Discordianism and its association with chaos, because he kind of agrees with what I said. I think it's politically inert. I don't think there's any value in saying, hey, you can be your own pope. The source of power and meaning making has, like, decades ago left the church. So that's like about as radical as making vicar jokes. And that's the kind of persistence of stuff that I say. I think this is inert, and I think it's shallow end stuff. When the construction of power is so runs along political, technocratic, materialist lines. Try and say, hand out cards to say you can be your own central banker and see what happens.
That would be a fun one. And of course, the really awful thing is that the Silicon Valley influence that Wilson had most conclusively, the people who are going around putting the smile economy into actuality, space migration, intelligence increase, life extension, the people who are funding that the most are Google, Elon Musk, and DARPA.
Yeah, absolutely. This is my. We have an awareness of this because, we can see Bob Wilson as who he was and a wider piece of information. But to kind of to pick it up and take it out of context, and I think to revivify the sort of least useful components of it is some. I mean, I don't care what people do, but they're not going to do it without me saying. There are much more valuable things, and funnily enough, now that I think about it, the Crowley analogy is apt, because the thing that I derive most from Wilson is actually his life story, because he kind of did, he did the acid thing. He worked on Madison Avenue. He was self-taught. I mean, I disagree. I don't like James Joyce. I think it's the most overrated writer of the 20th century, but that's fine. But he went on his own self-learning journey. Again, as you say, kind of like working poor made good. Good enough, didn't exactly die rich, but he lived his own life and lived his own journey, and that is where I think he lines up with Crowley. But we've beaten Crowley into that position, and as a result, he retains his usefulness to people. No one has beaten Bob Wilson into position.
I'm hoping that this revival will lead to that. I mean, that's one of the joys of what Daisy did in the stage version, is it's so far from a hagiography. And it's nice. Oliver Senton, who plays Bob, did an absolutely blinding job with that. And he makes him charismatic and fascinating, but also it shows us as a really flawed guy who almost destroyed his family on several occasions.
Yeah.
And had some really fucking iffy mates. But it also, one of the things it does make a point of doing is showing just how important Arlen was. She was played by Kate Alderton, who is a lovely, lovely woman and kind of British stage royalty, in that she's the daughter of Pauline Collins and John Alderton, who are names that people who grew up in the 70s will definitely recognise. And yeah, she absolutely nailed that Arlen's story is as important. And it is oddly unwritten. You can only find one photo of Arlen online if you Google her. Literally one, which is kind of strange. I mean, she wasn't particularly out there. But, she was a hardworking feminist. She was a poet. Her story has not really been told. And I'm hoping that gets fixed.
All right. So then if we were to... now, let me describe this a different way. Bob Wilson didn't just write Cosmic Trigger and Illuminatus. He also has some like Coincidence, Ishtar Rising, New Inquisition. There's a whole bunch of books that are out there that sort of wash around. If by some highly unlikely chance people listening to this have yet to read any Bob Wilson, let's do a book game version of it and sequence the books to get the best out of Bob.
Okay. Start with Cosmic Trigger 1. Flick through Cosmic Triggers 2 and 3 with a very, very careful eye, because they're as you noted, they're quite wonky. Yep. In terms of what they get out. And then they basically just continue the life story. They have a bit more about his relationship with Ken Campbell, though, which was worth noting. Though, interestingly, there's one part of the legend which Bob gets absolutely wrong because he didn't know it. And this is dramatised in the play, is that it wasn't the National Theatre who funded for him and Bob Shea to go to the premiere at the Cottesloe. It was the cast.
Nice.
Because, Luna had died like 7 or 8 months before. So he was absolutely destroyed by it. And basically Ken saying come over and see the play was the thing that got him out of his grief. And Arlen nagging him, so you get off your ass and fucking go and do this. So yeah, absolutely. Cosmic Trigger is the text to see. Of the other stuff, I would strongly think quantum psychology should come in next, because it isn't specific. He experiments, he describes it as the Sufi idea of scatter. Obviously, his idea of Sufism was kind of second or third hand. He didn't really, he was mostly drawing an Idris Shah, which is fine. Idris Shah knew his shit, but it's not a direct experience of Sufism, unlike, say, Peter Lamborn Wilson.
Yeah.
But there are the way he just pops ideas around it there. It gives you a nice overview. Then, honestly, I'd say the historical Illuminatus Chronicles, because in terms of the fictionalising, I think they did the best job of describing his own shamanic process, particularly the third one.
Very good.
Guardedly, you should probably read Prometheus Rising about them, but bearing in mind the whole problem with just how the actual biophysics of the 8-brain model is problematic. For me, the key thing there is it's his ideas of imprint vulnerability are useful, but yes. the rest has dated really quite severely.
It has, and I think that's a good spot to put it, because if you're playing, this hypothetical Bob Wilson book game, by then you'd be looking for tech. And there are pieces to kind of, there are suggestions that match each of the different circuits. So, it's not, I wouldn't for a minute suggest that there isn't usefulness in running through any kind of system. So that would be there. And
after that, sort of very vague wave of everything else. Yeah. Illuminatus as a novel is a really fucking hard read at this point. It's 70s plays. It's the anachronisms. The sexuality of it is kind of really quite iffy. It's kind of homophobic in a few places. Problematic faves, as they say. It's still got that. It's still very funny.
But that's why you sequence it further down, because you're right. It took them forever to get it published, and there's a good reason for it. It's actually not that good. It's as simple as that. It is still good, but it's not that good. And you have to bring a lot to it as a reader to get stuff out of it, hence putting it, sort of sequencing it a few books into the hypothetical recommendations.
Yeah, they did Adam Gorightly on his site did a read-through recently, kind of book club reading through of Illuminatus, which I sort of dipped into every now and then. And that had some really useful stuff about contextualizing it in the discussion, so that might be a useful read. I should put Masks of the Illuminati in there slightly earlier as well, because that's just fun. Even though his Jimmy Joyce obsession kind of got full ride in there. The jokes it plays on the history of the time, of playing with the conspiratorial Victorian axis there. There's some fun in that, and that little poem he makes up of the Devil's Masquerade, that's quite handy. Only a magus and a knight trueborn and a virgin unafraid may walk unharmed amidst the dance of the Devil's Masquerade. Yeah, that's a catchy stanza.
That's true. That's very true. I was thinking I would have put maybe the New Inquisition, or it's a little book. It was sort of like a reprint. I want to say the Illuminatus Papers.
That's a good one.
Because that's towards the end of the career where you can kind of what I think people need is an update. This is again the shallow end of the pool challenge, but I think is an update that as you read some of those sort of slimmer later books, you see him updating parts and kind of dropping other parts and realizing that he's not going to live forever in space, and Tim Leary's dead, so he isn't either. And I think there are still pieces of him. It was interesting in the final years because he dropped some of the ideas, but then really doubled down on ones that I think were useless, like his obsession with the mafia and James Joyce. But in the sort of, I think it's called Illuminatus Papers. It's another New Falcon one. It was during the reprint, and that's this slim little book where it's just a few old interviews with him and some sort of essay updates that I would maybe put somewhere in there. Certainly before some of the less good ones like Ishtar Rising.
Yeah. That's definitely not aged terribly well. Interesting side point, as a crew are staging Wilhelm Reich in Hell, his play.
I did not know that.
Yeah, there's a Kickstarter gone up for that. I think that expires in a couple of days. That's going to be in Leeds, so I'm definitely going to go to that one. So there are people who are going back to those other works. Yeah, New Inquisition especially, particularly in the face of the serious arseholeness of new atheism.
Absolutely, and the sheer technocratic construction of it's funny they're doubling down on materialism just as it looks flimsier and flimsier, and that's when from a inquisitorial perspective things get very dangerous.
Oh yeah. Again, this is one of those very useful little Discordian phrases: "Death to all fanatics."
Yeah. Well, that's not a bad spot to end on, actually. Death to all fanatics. Goodbye. Yeah. All right. So then, we've done quite well. I mean, any parting comments on Bob Wilson before we bring the show to an end? We've given him a good talking through.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt of that. Do take a look at what the various offshoots of what Daisy was doing. You can find all that lot at cosmictriggerplay.com. Maybe get into the revival, talk to the Festival 23 guys. But yeah, he was just this guy. He was, as he would put it, he was a semi-domesticated primate trying to work out what the fuck was going on in the universe. We can take some ideas from that. We can bin what we don't like because, we're just a bunch of monkeys grunting at each other. We may as well make it fun while we're doing it.
I like it. And for yourself, Mr. Vincent, where might people find you?
You can find me at catvincent.com or on Twitter at catvincent. I've also just started up a little newsletter. The whole weekly email newsletter thing is undergoing a bit of a renaissance at the moment, and I was strongly nagged by Warren Ellis to go and do this, so I did. And you can find that at tinyletter.catvincent with the C and the V capitalised. So there you go, fully pimped.
Nice one. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Thank you, Gordon. Lovely to talk to you, mate.
Okay. How about that then? Urban magic, sci-fi fandom, Forteana, comics, Neil Gaiman, Slenderman, Colin Wilson, polyamory, and all the Bob Wilson you could want. As you can probably tell, and as is the way with weekly podcasts, this one was recorded just before Christmas. Since then, the flooding in Kat's lovely corner of the world actually got a whole lot worse. So please do send your good thoughts in that general direction. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe in iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or on YouTube. And please do join the discussion by leaving a comment on the blog at runesoup.com or at the Facebook page, or find me on Twitter at Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. I'd love to hear what you think about urban magic and the role of fiction, and I feel quite sure there'll be some feedback and opinions on the late, great Robert Anton Wilson. Looking forward to it. Until next time.